So it turns out that the real challenge here, and this is what I'm pushing against, is people try to make an argument, like our current government, that there is one hard, fast, binary distinction in humans, and that binary distinction connects to all of these other capacities, cultural realities, and histories. And that is simply not true.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. Dr. Agustín Fuentes is a biological anthropologist whose research challenges entrenched ideas about what it means to be human. A professor at Princeton University, he is known for his work on human evolution, cooperation, creativity, and he is the author of influential books, including Why We Believe, Evolution and the Human Way of Being, and Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You. His most recent book, just out this spring, is Sex is a Spectrum, published by Princeton University Press, just in time to challenge several executive orders that have come out of the White House, but we'll get there in a minute. First of all, Agustín, great to have you with us at the New York Academy of Sciences on our Shaping Science podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Well, it's our honor. And so I'd like to begin because you are an anthropologist in the great Boasian tradition. You span the full range of disciplines that went into the creation of a 19th century discipline. A little bit about how you decided to do your work initially in biological anthropology. And I'll just say, by way of introduction, usually for anthropologists listening, there is a convention in the field as it's developed in the United States that there are four fields. And the four fields are sociocultural, linguistic, archaeological, and then physical or biological. But the four fields don't necessarily always cohabit easily. There were all kinds of splits that took place, a famous one at Stanford, another kind of rump department that grew up and became a separate department at Duke. And there was a split at Columbia, where I was chair of the anthropology department for a while. So there are lots of different flavors that anthropology comes in today. But it all goes back to a convention in which it was a kind of total field uniting the sciences, the social sciences, and the arts. Your work exemplifies that in a unique way, and as a particular delight for me as the former Franz Boas professor of anthropology at Columbia to acknowledge that and salute you for it. But tell us a little bit about your story. How did you choose to begin your work in biological anthropology, and how did you then, basically negotiate this kind of peculiar disciplinary terrain for the work you have done over now many years?
Well, it's such a big overview as to what anthropology is and could be. But for me in particular, I'm really interested in what makes us tick, both the big and the small. What is it about humans? What is it about primates? What is it about mammals? And I entered the University of California at Berkeley, sampling majors, if you will. I sort of moved through sort of pre-med, theater arts, zoology, sort of seeing what was going on. And I really liked zoology. But then a colleague of mine encouraged me to take a class in anthropology. It was an introduction to cultural anthropology. And I remember the first week in the class sitting there thinking, wait a minute. There's actually a field, a discipline, an area that asks about the human in all of these different ways. Then I took a biological anthropology class, then I took some archaeology classes, and I was immediately hooked. What's challenging is that, as you well know, at that time, this was in the 1980s at the University of California, Berkeley, there were a number of amazing faculty from all these different branches of anthropology who mostly hated each other and wouldn't speak to one another, but they offered us students something amazing. And so I drew from that. And I, to this day, continue to lean into my biological, ethnographic, archaeological, and zoological trainings and exposures to sort of try to create an integrative picture. And looking back, I've been called both in a positive light and a negative light a neo-Boasian, which is really funny. But I also think of sort of Boas and his integration. Antonin Fermin, the great Haitian anthropologist who pushed against sort of using the concept of race as a biological concept in humans. There's this long, I think, very powerful history of anthropologists drawing on the body, on histories, on cultures to try to help us better understand ourselves and to really push against reductionism. So that was a long ramble, but that's sort of where I am.
So no, it wasn't a long ramble. My introductory question was a long ramble, but apropos of that, I mean, let me go back a little bit to some of the earlier debates that were taking place in anthropology, because indeed there is this field that is specifically dedicated to this question that we ask all the time now. In an age of artificial intelligence, we're asking it more and more. What does it mean to be human? But of course, there's a lot that goes on in that question. And in the field of anthropology, there has been sometimes, not just quarrels, but real antipathy between those who think that to answer that question, you have to actually go back and look at us not only over our long evolutionary history, but in relationship to research, as you've done, on animals, on both primates and other animals. And then there are those, and we were talking about some of them before the podcast, who believe that culture is an autonomous system that separates, that distinguishes humans from any other kind of animal, and certainly, I'm sure, from machines as well. And that to think about, fundamental questions around what it means to be human behavior, questions that you raise in one work after the next, get derailed by a reference to our biological residuum. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that the assumption is that if you can find the biological basis of behavior, it's going to be fixed. It's going to be there over time, over space, across cultures, and it's going to actually somehow or another explain what it means to be human in relationship to our bodies, to our biology, to our physical determinations, and so on. So as someone who has been accused of being overly cultural by biological anthropologists and overly biological by cultural anthropologists, could you say something about how in your work you've negotiated this?
So yes, those two things are true. I get that from all sides. So here's the punchline of everything I do, and that is that humans are biocultural. You may want to focus only on the ethnographic, the cultural, the historical, the sociological. You may want to focus only on sort of genetics or the physiology or the circulatory system or how muscles develop or skeletons work. But any focus on just those things, while important, intellectually valid, is a insufficient contribution to understanding the whole of the human experience. So to understand humans, we have to know that we are born into a world of desires, of ideas, of ideologies, of built ecologies, of structures, of languages. But that world we're born into, we bring a biological, a genetic, a physiological reality. And the two, this culture and this biology, are not separate. They're always intertwined and co-mixed. And so the challenge for anthropology, and this is, I think, a major challenge that not everyone is up to right now because of these sort of petty differences about what's the right way to do work. The challenge to anthropology is how do we unravel, how do we engage with, how do we think through this incredible thing that is the human in ways that's integrative, that's intellectually generous, and that opens up opportunities for understanding rather than shuts them down. And that's, I think, where I sit right now, is trying to navigate and link teams of scholars, clusters of different researchers to work together, to collaborate, to understand from diverse voices, experiences, and perspectives, how do we engage the human? Because right now the challenge, not just in the academy, but in society writ large, is an attempt to strip away that complexity and to force a simplistic, usually racist, sexist, and oppressive notion of what it means to be human down everyone's throats. And I think anthropology is well positioned to stand up and say no.
Okay, so that's a great defense, I think, of the discipline. And it is something that I completely agree continues to make anthropology relevant, especially when we acknowledge and argue against the kind of way in which universities separate the two cultures of science and the arts, or whatever you want to call the social sciences, in a kind of broad way. And of course, the work that you do and the kinds of things you just said reflect the fact not only that you look both at the biological and the cultural, but you see the two as shaped by each other. And so they're not fixed in any kind of way, either, over time or over culture, but they're not fixed at any given moment because they're constantly being shaped and reshaped. Now, you've decided to take on questions of that kind with the really big challenges around understanding the role of biology in our human species. Questions around race, questions around gender and sexuality, questions around human belief, and of course belief in things that are not by any means reducible to the biological. But let's go to the work on race to start off with, because obviously race is an area that has been thought by many to be a fundamentally biological fact. When some of us in our world say race is a cultural construct or a social construct, people look at you like you have two heads. Tell us a little bit about your work on race and why you decided to take that on really early in your academic career.
I think one of the things that jumped out at me really powerfully was that the problem, and this I've seen in many contexts throughout my life and through my colleagues, family, friends, is that the problem is not race, it's racism. Mm-hmm. And so forefronting race as the issue of study in context always struck me as strange. So I asked myself, what are we talking about? What is this sort of? And I became very interested in biological variation, that is, variation in bodies, in skin, in hair, in blood, in genetics, in muscles, in skeletons across humans, because I had been studying this across other animals. Mm-hmm. And certain things jump out at you at the patterns and flow of this biological variation. So the interest in humans was that we perceive, as you said, humans as clustered into these morphological categories, these things we're going to call race because they look different. Mm-hmm. But then once you travel around the world, and I've been lucky enough to do a lot of this, you realize that none of those categories work. Skin color, hair type, face, nose, genetics, none of those things clusters humans into particular kinds of biological groups. Those things don't work, not by ancestry, not by continental types, et cetera, et cetera. So then you're stuck with this conundrum. Why are people trying to classify using these biological characteristics when they actually don't work? Right? There's no such thing as black in the sense of skin color for humans, right? Dark skin is actually typical across our entire species. Mm-hmm. And dark skin cannot be used to identify someone to a particular place of origin, be it a continent or be it a region. Same goes for light skin. So I became very interested in understanding what that distribution is. And then when I studied that distribution, and as many, many people have, and looked at it, I realized that people were misrepresenting it. People were intentionally presenting clusters as if they were real things biologically and using them in support of racist agendas, or even agendas they didn't realize were racist, but they thought were. And this is really characteristic of a lot of the biomedical realm, to think race is the cause when, in fact, it's racism. And so I became incredibly driven, maybe is the right word, to try to take this information that was common knowledge, right, increasingly common knowledge in much of the sciences and anthropology, and move it into the public space, not with the race is a social construct argument, which it is, but with the biology doesn't get us race. Then we can talk about why we have race. So the idea that race is a social construct, which it is, doesn't mean it's not real. Race has real impacts. It has huge impacts on biology, on lives, on economics, on histories. But it's not a biological thing. Biology doesn't get us race. And so that was really the impetus. And this was coming more from a zoological background. I saw the variation out there. I'm like, well, the biology of humans doesn't map to these groups.
So, but let's push down on this a little bit, because of course, we mentioned Franz Boas, both because he was the Papa Franz, Papa Boas, father, if I can use that term, of American anthropology. But he was one of the first to say that there's no clear biological correlation or determination of race, or race is not a clear biological concept, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have an administration today that has just proscribed any research, say, of a biomedical kind on different races. And we know that there are some distinctions having to do with disease, having to do with medical responses to different kinds of interventions, but, sickle cell, among other things, that cluster around different kinds of biological phenotypes.
Right.
So how do you negotiate that? Because you actually understand the biological, zoological character of our highly differentiated human species on the one side, and I'm sure, see correlations of different kinds with different kinds of real observable physical characteristics. And yet, you're critical of people as a kind of as a habit of classifying others in relationship to race.
Yeah.
And so, I get the point that it's not just a kind of neutral classification, it's a hierarchical classification. Right. But part of the problem is classification itself, is it not?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to push you a little bit to ask you how you then are able to recover, a sense of the proper biological domain of right. racial characteristics on the one side, and yet keep that sharply separated off from any kind of attribution of anything else, whether intelligence right. on the one side, or even some set of physical characteristics on the other with respect to race.
So I think that's really important, and I'll even sort of lay out. I think this is much older than Boas in some ways. So Antonin Fermin, an incredible sort of what you call an early biological anthropologist, 40 years before Boas, or 30 years, was making these kinds of arguments. Boas picked them up, and others did as well. I think what we need to understand is, and I always use sickle cell as an example. So there are many sickling alleles, that is, genetic characteristics that facilitate a kind of disorder, which causes the red blood cells to sickle and make it hard to absorb oxygen or transport oxygen. So that is distributed in many ways. Some of that distribution is very high in West Africa and in a few other parts of the continent of Africa, and also in the Circum-Mediterranean region, right, especially mm-hmm. the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean, and also in South Asia. And so there's the real interesting thing. In the United States, we think sickle cell disease, African Americans. Mm-hmm. But in fact, South Asian Americans also have a high frequency of that in certain contexts and some others. And so what we need to understand is, where is the biological variation really out there, and what is connected? So for example, hypertension is characteristic of certain races in the mm-hmm. United States, but those same races, those people in the Caribbean, for example, don't have hypertension. So we have to think, what are we actually talking about? And here we come back to biological variation. We have these social categories of people that are real. They're historical, they're economic, they're political, they exist. But then we have to understand, how does the genetic, biological, circulatory, physiological patterns map to them? And so what I try to point out, particularly in the medical context, is that there are many things that happen to our body because of the exposures those bodies have. And in a hierarchically discriminatory society like ours, you're going to see certain bodies who are attacked more regularly than other bodies by environmental, social, economic contexts, and those bodies will wear the marks frequently of those attacks. But the common things people associate with racial classifications, skin color, facial shape, nose shape, hair type, those don't actually work. And what's really interesting is that the real differences health-wise, for example, in biological issues of health that we see, are the product of socially structured inequities and harms. And so understanding the biology and the culture and the history here all becomes important. Again, this is why people should study anthropology. This is what we do.
So a lot of your work is, in a way, debunking, biological myths. And yet, even as you do that, you do obviously acknowledge and study the biological, characteristics, as it were,
Absolutely.
of our lives. And so you're constantly, in a way, having to go back and forth between referring to biology as a thing, not a static thing, right, but an important element of what it means to be human. At the same time that you're constantly showing that many of the ways in which we think about biology are fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
But this is a hugely challenging kind of way of operating in the world, and it often is very hard for people to understand. How it can be that you have something like nature or biology that nevertheless is being affected by behavior, cultural upbringing, differential parts of life that have nothing to do with biology, like the particular diets that one may be brought up to think of as the diet you should use and consume. So as you do this, you in a way are making an argument about culture, but you're also making an argument about biology. So I want to ask you a little bit about your relationship with other biologists, and are there major debates that you participate in that have to do with the world of biological sciences more broadly, leaving anthropology in a sense to the side just for a moment?
Absolutely. And I think what's really important is my big sort of fight with many anthropologists, many of my colleagues, anthropologists, is they don't read biology. They don't really know about how physiological, biological systems. On the flip side, my fight with a lot of biologists, human biologists in particular, and sort of broader sort of evolutionary biologists that I work with and fight with sometimes, is that they don't actually read sociocultural, sociological, or even history and philosophy of science. And that's a problem because science never exists in a vacuum. And so I would say that the conflicts I have are frequently over sort of theoretical framings. How do we talk about biology in particular contexts? Do we always go with an essentialist or reductionist perspective? Are there ways in which, for example, in contemporary evolutionary biology, where you've got multiple levels of analysis and different ways of thinking about developmental dynamics, DNA as sort of active agents, but not the exclusive sort of focus of natural selection or other things like that. So there's a lot of debates in biology right now, theoretically and methodologically, that are hot, that are ongoing. But the problem is many folks who practice biology, and there are many amazing scholars, but there are also, even those who are good methodologically, theoretically are a little bereft. They're not thinking about their discipline as part of a system of knowledge that is human conducted, human structured, and human influenced. And so they'll make assertions frequently that are glaringly ignorant of basic historical framings, basic sort of social cultural, socio-political framings, and that they don't recognize that that too is part of biology. That too is part of our study. And so, I mean, I think there's so many great sort of philosophers and historians of science out there. And I think that should be reading in every intro bio class. And it's not.
Yeah, no. And of course, this is another aspect in which the two cultures, as C.P. Snow put it, I think gets in the way not only of our understanding of human variability and the like, but also of how you ask the right kinds of questions, or you ask the best kinds of questions under the circumstances that you can ask, that lead you to devise various kinds of biological experiments, right? And I'm sure you have lots of examples of where you might look at an experiment and say, you're not actually testing the right things, or you're not making the right distinctions between what is assumed and what is somehow out there to be seen as part of what you're trying to examine.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important, because this is why anthropology fails on one hand with the lone wolf research paradigm, where a single scholar goes out there. But this is also where biology fails with the sort of reductionist lab-based focus. And so both of those areas could be enriched by working in broader teams or more diverse teams or different disciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary teams, because more diverse experience and opinion, depending on your questions, can facilitate a slight expansion of the range of possible methodological and theoretical toolkits that you're bringing to bear. So I always ask, rather, don't start with what's your theory and what's your method. What is your question? And what theory and method can you bring to those questions? And this is why I'm a big antagonist of C.P. Snow's. I don't think humanities and physics are all that separate all the time, nor should they be.
I think Snow himself, who of course was a novelist, failed novelist, but nevertheless somebody who practiced in the arts and thought of himself also at that point as a scientist, didn't have a very sophisticated understanding, except insofar as he argued for greater scientific literacy for people in the humanities. But but what you're talking about is a different level of interaction between the two cultures, and in fact, it's a way of reconceptualizing the idea that there are two cultures at all. But on the one hand, I think your work issues a lot of very provocative challenges for the conduct of the biological sciences. But you also, of course, take your aim at great humanist questions as well. So in your work on why we believe, I'd like you to say a little bit about, what made you think about taking that on as a question, but how you grappled with the question of belief as someone who, having worked a great deal with animals and others who presumably don't have the same kinds of or levels of belief. How you decided to take on that almost quintessentially humanist question?
I think I've always been interested in that. I'm fascinated by religion, but I'm also fascinated by human commitments to ideologies, to political patterns, to things like that. But I was really lucky enough over the past few decades to collaborate not just with folks in anthropology and biology, but in fact with a number of philosophers and theologians, a wide variety of humanists. And it was those engagements, those deep conversations, reading with and through much of their work and sort of classic works in these areas, and my work with various indigenous colleagues, that is indigenous to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, Southern Africa, helped me think through different perspectives. And I recognized that a common characterization of why we believe or belief or ideologies or concepts or things like that resided almost always exclusively in the area of the humanities, or this kind of sort of humanistic approach, or exclusively in this sort of neurobiological or genetic reductionist approach. And again, as with everything, I thought, well, there's got to be a linkage here. There's got to be things connected. And so I became very, very interested in trying to reconstruct the glimmerings, those first signs of things, of material remains in the human past that would provide potential indications of some kind of meaning making, some kind of commitment. And that led me down the road of this sort of paleoarchaeology and archaeology and then neurobiology and then cognitive sciences. And I realized there was a through thread that these things were actually all related. And thinking with a number of philosophers and theologians helped me recognize that belief is an incredibly powerful capacity that humans have. But what constitutes belief is not just the histories and the philosophies and the conceptualizations, but it's also the neurobiologies, the psychologies, and the cognitive processes. And so I tried to weave a small narrative, for example, in the book, Why We Believe, that is really about how we believe. And at the end, I get to why we believe, but why we believe what we believe, I think, is we are who we meet. We are who we grow up with. But our capacity for belief, for conceptualization, and the dynamic assemblages of the ways in which our cognition, our brains, our bodies, and our histories come together.
So what is your argument about the human proclivity towards belief?
I think the human commitment to belief, right? So believing, it is a proclivity. I would say we're all there, right? All humans believe. And people always think I'm talking about religious faith or traditions. And that's one form of belief. But this ability of the human to imagine more than the here and now, to cast one's mind far afield to the future, to possibilities that don't even exist, and fully and wholly commit to them. That's absolutely incredible. And that's probably distinctive in the animal kingdom. And so that really interests me. And so how that manifests itself in bodies and in lives, I think becomes really important. It also made me look at some primates and others, not for belief, but for senses of awe and wonder, different kinds of catalysts that are participant in human belief, but that might show up in other organisms. And they're there. But humans do something different, because when we experience awe, when we experience this incredible, overwhelming belief in something, this commitment to it, it changes how we see the world, how we perceive the world, and how our bodies act in the world.
All right. Well, again, your work is so rich and it covers so many different kinds of fundamental human questions that I'm tempted to keep probing into your work on belief. But before we get to your most recent book, say a little bit more about what is distinctively human, even at the biological level. Obviously, we have a longer period of maturation than other animals. And we are therefore even more, as it were, influenced by behavioral kinds of conditions under which we grow up and acculturate. But is that just a matter of degree, or is there at some point a fundamental matter of kind? And I'll get to the question about machines at the very end, perhaps, since that now is something we're all thinking about when we think about what is distinctiveness, what is distinctive about the human.
No, I think it's really important. I never use the term unique because all organisms are unique. That's how evolution works. Each lineage is somewhat unique. That's what makes it a lineage. Humans are distinctive, I think, in many important ways. As mammals, we're particularly interesting in our locomotory patterns, right? Bipedality. We can't underrate that. That's actually really important in sort of skeletal structure and the way our bodies work and function. You I think, hit the nail on the head with our slow development. Humans are just really, really weird in the sense that we've stretched out sort of infancy and ontogeny, the sort of childhood development and adult development into this very, very slow extended process. And in that time period, particularly very early in life, we were completely reliant on other humans, other members of our community, our caretaking team to sort of co-shape us. And I think that is one of the most distinctive things because we acquire biology via culture. That is, our brains and bodies are growing in particular nutritional, sociocultural activity landscapes, right? Belief systems. And so we co-opt that. And when I say we're biocultural, it's really that childhood development that is the best example of that. So that's very distinctive. Other organisms, a baby giraffe is born and, 25 minutes later, it's running across the savannah. Even a baby chimp is born and it takes years and years to develop, but it can almost grab onto its mother's fur right away. Human infants sort of lay there for a few years having trouble holding up their head till they get up and fall down a bunch of times. Human infants are much better than that, but I think you get the picture. And so I think that development is another distinctive thing. But we cannot underplay the sort of contemporary cognitive processes of humanity. The linguistic framing, the fact that we have language and particularly complex cultures that involve material, perceptual, ideological, and historical contexts simultaneously. That's also really distinctive. I would argue many organisms have culture, but human culture is a very, very, very special and powerful thing. And I think that's something. So bipedality, slow development, culture, and language all make us the messy, complex, fascinating creatures that we are.
So I'll come back to the question about language because that, of course, also invokes the whole specter of the LLM. But let's turn to your latest book, Sex is a Spectrum. You published the book after an executive order came from the White House telling us there were two sexes, two genders. So there's that. But for the listeners to our podcast, it would be, I think, great if you could just summarize the kind of argument of the book. What kinds of animal studies and the like do you use? And then ultimately, what is your argument about the biological character of both gender and sex?
Yeah, I think that's really important. One thing I want to emphasize here is the subtitle of the book is The Biological Limits of the Binary. And I think that's really important because what I'm trying to point out here, when I say sex is a spectrum, people think, 3 sexes, 5 sexes. No. Humans have 2 sexes. Mm-hmm. But sex is not a binary. A binary, think of this as a 1 and a 0, right? They're both the same category number, but a 1 and a 0 have nothing in common, right? There is no overlap aside from belonging to the same category. Human sexes and genders are not 1s and 0s, right? Mm-hmm. Our bodies, in fact, are made up of the same tissues, the same hormones, same physiologies. There's nothing that is completely unique in a woman's body, a man's body, a male body, a female body. But there are typical distributions of this variation. So that's what a spectrum is. A spectrum has all the same stuff, like color or sound, moving across a spectrum that has typical clusterings that maybe most of that spectrum falls into. But in between those typical clusterings, there's also individuals and variation, and so we don't lose that. So I think that's what I'm arguing is a spectrum is not denying that there are males and females, but saying that males and females are not binary things, that they share more than they are different, and that not every human falls into those categories. And this is actually true for much of the animal kingdom. So we see a lot of variation. I don't get into plants in the book because they just make sex crazy. But let's not go there. But I encourage folks to look it up for themselves. I look at a lot of animal biology to show that while certain things are binary, like gametes, there's an egg and a sperm, two different types of gametes. Gametes are not adult organisms. And organisms that produce gametes have multiple different ways of being. So there's no one way to be a male. For example, for fish, for mammals, for reptiles, for birds, there's no one way to be a female. And so what we have to understand is that there's a lot of variation out there, and understanding how that variation is partitioned to different species and lineages, that's the challenge. And it turns out, unexpectedly, or no, not unexpectedly, that humans are amongst the most difficult to understand, because our biological variation is in fact less differentiated between sexes than most. There's a lot of variation that is found in between our typical clustering of sexes in humans, but we also have gender. We also have these cultural, linguistic, ideological, perceptual, experiential realities that blend with our bodies and represent themselves in that way. So really, humans have gender, sex. You can't have just gender and just sex. The two things are always connected. And so this book, in this moment, ended up being what I hope is a contribution to a better conversation. There's so much ignorance, fear, anger, confusion around bodies and gender identities right now that we need a better conversation. So people should have basic understanding of what's animal biology look like, what does human biology look like, what does human gendered experience look like, and how do we understand the fact that that stuff is always all mixed together.
So, this is obviously a minefield today, to say the least. But let's hold that and ask you to give some examples from work in the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
Because there are, the wrasse.
The wrasse, yeah, the blue-headed wrasse.
The blue-headed wrasse.
Yeah.
There are animals that, species that, that basically have a very different kind of ontogeny or whatever.
Yeah.
And, there's a moment when certain kinds of sexual organs have to be evolved, redone to meet the need, because of course at some level sex is about reproduction, but reproduction can be challenged when there is a very specific kind of distribution of these sexual organs, functions, and roles. So it's a fascinating part of your book.
So one of the real critiques of me and my work is that there's a binary, right? There's males and females in the world. But you look at, there's a whole number of bony fish that go through sort of male and female stages in their lives. And so my argument is that if the same body, the same set of DNA can embody literally the entire range of sexual reproductive function, sexes are not two different kinds of things, right? They're different patterns, different clusters. And so it's really interesting. There's a range of fish that are born sort of either producing, they develop into, as adults, either producing large gametes, the eggs or ovum, or small gametes, sperm. And then given social or ecological contexts, their bodies, a bunch of genes turn on and off, and their physiology internally, it's like a science fiction movie, redoes itself to produce the other kind of gamete. And sometimes there are social cues that push these things back and forth. Why is that important? Can humans do that? No, that's not what humans do. But it shows us that the assumption that there is a universal male and a universal female, that understanding what gametes one produces tells us most of what we need to understand about a body or a life, is just not true. And then there's a number of other organisms. There's naked mole rats, these incredible little rodents that live in these subterranean caverns that have a social system that is almost the same as many bees, right? This sort of weird social caste system where there's one sort of dominant female who reproduces, a bunch of other females who are sort of workers and don't reproduce, and a bunch of males. But they have fairly typical mammalian hormone levels and physiology. So we don't even know why that's the case. So that's another different version. Birds who have different types of bodies. There's just a number of examples of other animals that do sex in different ways. Is this telling us about humans? No, humans do sex and biology in a particular way. But what it tells us is there's no single way to do male or female in the animal kingdom, Plus, a lot of organisms don't even have just male or female. They have sort of male and hermaphrodite or female and hermaphrodite, or they're all hermaphrodites. Or, as in many humans, we see intersexual development, where we see development that is totally within the range of human experience, but it doesn't fall cleanly into the cluster of what we're going to call male or female.
So the question that I'm sure you get asked a lot is, if it is the case that there's such extraordinary variability across the animal kingdom in relationship to certain kinds of core sexual biological elements and functions, fine, okay, that's the world is made up of a lot of crazy stuff. But what does that really have to do with humans? And of course, the current debate about gender affirming therapeutic, everything from the use of hormones to surgery, is one, of course, where the criticism is that one is disturbing nature.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think this is really important, critically important. And here, one thing to point out is, yes, there's a lot of variation in sort of sex biology around the world in different organisms, right? And in humans, we have patterns, typical patterns of sex biology, sex biology, but they vary. And there are many humans that do not fall into those typical patterns. However, this is not a story about, let's say, modification therapy through hormones or something like that. That's a very, 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 very small percentage of humans. But what I think is really important is we modify ourselves through pharmacological means all the time. That's actually a whole other sort of discussion. What I want to point out is that our basic understanding of what is available in humans for biological variation is pretty broad, even though, and this is really important for us and for other animals, there are typical patterns. So most humans, for example, fall into a fairly typical pattern of development of genitals, of gonads, that's associated with particular genetic categories. Now, there's a lot of variation within these typical patterns, and then there's people that fall outside these typical patterns. And here's the important part with humans, that's the biological landscape. And there's an enormous array of cultural identity, gendered experience, individual experience in these contexts. So as everyone knows, and this is something people don't talk about, there's not a one-to-one correlation between which genitals you have and who you're sexually attracted to. There's not a one-to-one correlation between which gonads you have, right, testes or ovaries, and sort of how much you like to care for infants or how well you cook or, how good your math skills are. So it turns out that the real challenge here, and this is what I'm pushing against, is people try to make an argument, like our current government, that there is one hard, fast, binary distinction in humans, and that binary distinction connects to all of these other capacities, cultural realities, and histories. And that is simply not true.
Okay, you heard it here on Shaping Science. But I think it's incredibly important that work like yours gets a wide reading, so that people can understand how you can make certain kinds of claims that you just made, that certain things are true and certain things aren't true, that we know from both science and also from deep analysis of the kinds of things that go into these analyses of sex gender.
And I think this is really important because some of my colleagues, biologists who critique this, are saying, Augustine, you're saying, oh, sex is all over. I'm like, no. There's males and females, and there's this range of variation around there. But what they're not doing is thinking philosophically and humanistically about what's their goal, what are their perceptions? Because in many cases, people who say, well, all we need to know about sex is whether you produce an egg or a sperm, that's an essentialist argument. That's arguing that is the essence that explains the evolutionary, physiological, and therefore psychological, cognitive, and cultural characteristics. That went out thousands of years ago as a powerful explanatory toolkit. And so we have to think, well, what do we know about biological processes and developments? What do we know about cultural and individual experiences? And lean into the mess. Humans are not simple. Anyone who tells you there's a simple one-to-one correlation between anything about humans is either intentionally lying to you or is just a weird human.
Well, one thing that I think, anthropology does convey, and it conveys it through the work that you've been referring to in biological physical anthropology, it conveys it through the work that I've done primarily in social and cultural anthropology, is that the range of variability, differences in the human species is such that we haven't even begun to explore what it all implies. But we just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to go back to the question that you raised before about language and its relationship to being human. And we often think, in fact, that is, in fact, all the different kinds of things that make up the distinctiveness of the human, qua human, language is it. Okay, now all of a sudden we have, as of November 2022, artificial intelligence coined as a term in 1956, but it didn't produce readable prose, certainly with the speed and relative veracity that it now can. That we now see every time we look at Gemini or GPT or whatever, and all of a sudden the question is maybe language is not something that you can say is distinctly human. I just wonder if you had thoughts about that, because language indeed is another part of the anthropological canon, but we're now having to rethink a lot of what we imagine language to imply for our distinctiveness as a species.
Yeah, no, I agree totally, and I think there's a lot. I have many, many thoughts on this, but I think this specific thing about language though is not writing. Language is not the construction of sentences or even an effective deployment of grammar in both writing and the construction of sentences. Language is also, as anthropologically we can demonstrate, a sense of place, a sense of being, a way of feeling into the world, a way of relating to others. And so I am not convinced by any stretch of the imagination that these large language models sense and feel and engage in the way that humans do via language, even though they can quite effectively at this point give us sentences, sort of draw and construct arguments using a human language. That doesn't mean that they are linguistic beings. And I think this is the important component here. We are beings who are linguistic in as much as our language, we embody the perceptions, the experiences, the senses, the sensualities, and we deploy those in ways that are relational and not always verbal and linguistic. So language is not always spoken, even thought or read. It is frequently embodied and experienced. And I think that's the point we're at. And so many movies show sort of these anthropoid robots, these androids that have kind of intelligence, and they show them being human. We're nowhere near that. And I'm not sure we're ever going to get to that.
Well, synthetic biology is a whole part of the scientific world that is working very hard to prove you wrong. They're generating or figuring out how to generate organs, and there'll be robots that look very much like you and me, I assume, at some point in the future. And then we'll be able to perhaps test the proposition. But your argument is that ultimately, like everything else, language, like culture, like behavior, is embodied. Yes. And it's embodied in a human context in which it is shaped by everything from its elements, its core constitutive features, to all the experiential shaping that takes place over the course of a lifetime and through our histories and societies and cultures and the like. And in as much as that invokes just about every discipline, from philosophy to biology, from physics to linguistics, it once again tells you that anthropology is a very fine place to play if you're interested in these kinds of broad questions about what it means to be human. Agustín, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I feel like we've only scraped the surface, so I hope we can invite you back to our studio here in New York to talk some more about your work.
Absolutely. Anytime, I'll be here.
And that was Shaping Science. So we're delighted to have this opportunity to talk to a really, really fascinating anthropologist who does it all. Agustín, thanks so much.
Thank you.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.